It's 3 o'clock here in Uppsala, and I welcome you back to the 5th session of the Löwdin Symposium. For the next 2 hours, we're going to listen to 3 lectures by So, Alan, and Martin. After that, we're going to again have a 1-hour intermission, and then we're going to have our final 6th session. So let's start off with this session. So, are you there? Hi, So.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you.
You're welcome. And I see you're already sharing the screen. Excellent. So if you go over in full screen mode there, you did that. Thank you. So for the next 40 minutes, the forum is yours.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for joining in. And most of all, I'd like to thank Roland Lin for organizing this exciting event and also having me as a part of it. So this is the same view graph that I used for the Löwdin lecture in 2016, where I listed the many accomplishments of Löwdin. And I highlighted the fact that in spite of his better known accomplishment in the area of reduced density matrices and natural orbitals, Löwdin seems to be most obsessed with perturbation theory, having published as many as 14 papers with the title Studies in Perturbation Theory. And this obsession or passion of perturbation theory apparently infected Löwdin's student, who is Rod Bartlett, who went on to become the world's foremost expert in perturbation theory for chemistry. And this obsession, in turn, infected me as I was a postdoc of Rod's. And ever since, for nearly 20 years, I have been mostly studying perturbation theory. In the last 10 years or so, almost exclusively on perturbation theory, if I count cup cluster theory as a variant of perturbation theory. And recently, I think I have found a surprising failure or even a catastrophe of many-body perturbation theory when it's applied to thermodynamics. And this is caused by, not by trivial thing, but the fundamental inability of Taylor series expansion of a non-analytic function, which Boltzmann factor is. So this is something that is almost impossible to eliminate within the framework of perturbation theory. So this is something that I want to talk about today. So this may be a powerful antidote to this obsession that 3 generations of scientists have been inflicted. So here's the context of my talk. First, I'd like to remind the audience that extensivity of energy, which is the basis of thermodynamics, actually originate from the charge neutrality of the ensemble. Then I would move on to a rather sensational question. Is the textbook finite temperature many-body perturbation theory really correct? And I will try to convince you that this theory is not entirely incorrect, but it's lacking. Okay? It's not quite satisfactory. Then I will move on to introduce what I consider to be a more correct many-body perturbation theory for thermodynamics with the analytical formulas at first and second orders. Then I will come back to this main question, this low temperature failure of perturbation theory, which is known as Kohn-Luttinger conundrum. Now, if you open any undergraduate level textbook of thermodynamics, it typically starts by saying that energy is extensive, entropy is extensive, temperature is intensive, and so on. And these are the foundational assumptions for the thermodynamic theory to be valid. And when we say that energy is extensive, we mean that energy is, roughly speaking, additive, or energy is asymptotically proportional to the volume of the system. So 2 cans of Coke, twice the calories, this is something that is so ingrained to our common sense that we don't really question it. But if you do question this notion, it's kind of puzzling, because the energy of a chemical system is a sum of pairwise interactions. And the number of pairwise interaction grows quadratically with the volume of the system. So naively, the energy should be proportional to the square of the volume, not linear. Of course, this is not the case. And the fact that the energy is still extensive is because in any chemical system, a spontaneous local charge neutrality is maintained. So we have roughly equal number of positive and negative charges. So there is almost exact cancellation between attractive and repulsive Coulomb interactions, leaving behind effective chemical interactions, which are very short-ranged and relatively weak. So these two kinds of codes, they're not interacting chemically. That's the basis of this additivity of energy and extensivity of energy. So this is why thermodynamics works for chemical system. Now, if you go to different systems, such as gravitational system, this is not the case anymore. We have only positive masses and we have only attractive gravitational interactions, which are never screened. Then the energy is not extensive, and chemical or equilibrium thermodynamics, as we know it, doesn't work for this kind of system. Even for a system that consists of electrons, if you violate this charge neutrality, energy is once again not extensive and thermodynamics breaks down. Okay? And these electrons behave completely differently than the electrons in this system. So with this preparation, let's ask ourselves this provocative question. Is the finite temperature perturbation theory described in many textbooks really correct? And this part of the work is done by my graduate student, Puneet Jha. And he received IBM Löwdin Award in 2019 from Sunnyvale Symposium for this work. Now, if you go to any one of these standard textbooks on quantum many-body theory, you will find that they dedicate one chapter on finite temperature many-body perturbation theory for electrons in grand canonical ensemble. So here we define the so-called grand partition function xi, which is the sum of these exponentials, where beta is the inverse temperature, E is state energy, and sub I is number of electrons. And this summation is taken over all possible states with any number of electrons. And this chemical potential mu is determined by satisfying this charge neutrality condition that I mentioned 2 pages ago. And after determining this grand partition function with a chemical potential, we can derive any thermodynamic function from it, such as grand potential, which is the free energy in the grand canonical ensemble, or internal energy, which is a thermal average of all state energies. And furthermore, if we define this operator C hat as such, which has eigenvalues as the summand of grand partition functions, then this C hat satisfies this Bloch equation. We can easily verify this by substitution. And you can see that this equation is isomorphic to time-dependent Schrödinger equation, with beta serving as imaginary time. And therefore, all these machineries of time-dependent diagrammatic perturbation theory for energies, solving the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, can be transferred to solve the Bloch equation for thermodynamic functions at finite temperature. So this is a very beautiful basis, starting point of this finite temperature many-body perturbation theory. However, its implementation is unbelievably tedious to the extent that I consider is intractable. The deriving second-order perturbation correction formula at the zero temperature perturbation theory is just a one-page derivation. And the Rayleigh-Schrödinger formula that I actually use it as a homework to undergraduate student. But doing the same at finite temperature perturbation theory is 40 pages of mathematical torture. And I couldn't do it alone. And I asked my former postdoc, Professor Xiao He, to decipher this chapter and summarize it. And he came back with this 40 pages of very detailed derivation, with which I could only verify the derivation. I couldn't do it alone. So this is how complicated it is. But the worst part is you cannot be fully confident about this result that is described in the textbook. The reason being that all these chapters go back to this key paper written by Walter Kohn and Joachim Laringer in 1960. So in this paper, these authors pointed out that there is a fundamental mathematical inconsistency between the finite temperature many-body perturbation theory and zero temperature perturbation theory, which has been the latter being fully verified, fully established by people like Melon Preset, Rod Bartlett, John Popo, etc. Specifically, what they found is that if you take the zero temperature limit of the second order correction to internal energy, U2, this is the internal energy, it's a thermal average of energy, this may not converge, this may not agree with the second order correction to energy from zero temperature perturbation theory for degenerate systems. So on this basis, these authors concluded that the VG series is therefore in general not correct. The VG series standing for Bruckner-Goldstone perturbation theory series. So when I read this is the last sentence of the introduction. I was so surprised, I almost fell off my chair. So reflecting this paper, which is basically questioning the validity of the theory that these textbook chapters are describing, and of course, these textbooks came after this paper. These authors of the textbooks that have to include this very tortured statement about this theory. For example, Ma Chiang and Sampantha, by the way, this is my absolute favorite textbook. It's wonderful, except that they have to have this remark. A note of caution is called for whenever we attempt to calculate zero T property from an expression for the same quantities at non-zero T by taking the limit T goes to zero. The physics is not necessarily the same in both cases. So physics is not the same at finite temperature or zero temperature, which is a very hard statement to swallow. It almost sounds defeatist. And a very similar story with this textbook written by another Nobel Prize winner, this D.J. Thalers. He wrote, in any case, it serves as a warning against taking the results of perturbation theory too seriously. And he was referring to specifically this Kohn-Luttinger inconsistency problem. So I gathered that there is a hole in understanding of fundamental physics in the area of finite temperature perturbation theory. So this is also opportunity for us to make some progress, but I didn't know how to start, where to start, until Peter Knowles reminded me of the existence of the canonical definition of any perturbation theory, of any quantity with any partitioning of Hamiltonian or any reference wave function in the context of a different perturbation theory project where Peter and I collaborated on. And this definition is that nth order correction of any quantity x is defined as the nth derivative of the same quantity x defined or calculated exactly, that is by full CI with a perturbation scaled Hamiltonian. And the differentiation is taken with respect to lambda, which is the dimensionless parameter multiplying this perturbation operator v hat. So lambda equal 1 corresponds to the real physical system. Lambda equal 0 corresponds to the reference. And this definition exactly matches this usual perturbation expansion of this quantity. And it is rather straightforward to do a full CI calculation at finite temperature. Because with a full CI, not only do we have the exact energy for the ground state, we also have the exact energy of all states, excited states, ionized and electron touch states, and so on. So we can brute force calculate this ground partition function. And we can also brute force determine this chemical potential by satisfying this equation numerically by, for example, bisexual method. This is a neutrality condition. So in this way, we can determine any thermodynamic function as a function of temperature all the way down to zero temperature. And we, of course, do not see any inconsistency, the kind of inconsistency that Kohn-Luttinger was talking about in the context of perturbation theory. So going from this, what I call the thermal full CI or finite temperature full CI to finite temperature perturbation theory, it's just a matter of repeating this thermal full CI calculation with the various values of lambdas and differentiating them numerically, for example, with respect to lambda. Then we will arrive at infallible benchmarks for at least several lowest order perturbation corrections for all these quantities. So this is exactly what I asked Puneet Jha to undertake. So I asked him to implement this finite temperature fruit CI, which allowed the variation of lambda, numerically differentiating the results, and obtain this benchmark results, which I call the lambda variation benchmarks, and compare those numbers against the textbook numbers, the textbook formulas numbers. And this is what he found. So the zeroth order finite temperature perturbation theory is known as the Fermi-Dirac theory, which can be found in virtually any solid state physics textbook. And the derivation is very elegant. It's very short, half a page or so. And this defines omega zero, the zeroth order correction to free energy or ground potential, and U zero, zeroth order correction to internal energy by these formulas, both of which depends on the famous Fermi-Dirac distribution function, which includes this zeroth order correction to chemical potential, which is determined by none other than neutrality condition. Now, if you evaluate these formulas, we obtain these blue-colored numbers for omega zero and U zero, and they agree exactly with this lambda variation benchmark. So we can say that the Fermi-Dirac theory is perfect, and the textbook formulas for omega zero and U zero are correct. But this is not the case if you go to first order. First of all, it's rather challenging to locate the agreed upon formula for omega 1. But this seems to be the formula for omega 1. But there also seems to be a rather big confusion about whether to identify this as omega 1 or U1 in some textbooks. But it's very hard to find any discussion about mu1, first order correction to chemical potential, or the formula for U1. Now, if you evaluate this formula as a function of temperature, we obtain these red colored numbers, and they do not agree with the lambda variation benchmark for omega 1, or U1 for that matter. So we must conclude that the textbook formula for omega 1 seems incorrect, and U1 and mu1 are unknown. And a similar story at the second order. This is a second order formula, and we don't really find a discussion about the formula for mu2 or U2. And if you evaluate this formula, we obtain these numbers in red, and they don't look anything like the correct lambda variation benchmark for omega 2. Strangely, at lower temperature, this omega 2 values from the textbook is closer to U2 values, but in the general temperature, they don't agree with the U2 either. So we have to say that the textbook formula for omega 2 is incorrect, and U2 and mu2 are unknown. So what's wrong with the textbook formula? It seems like beyond the zeroth order Fermi-Dirac theory, the textbook finite temperature perturbation theory disagrees with the benchmarks and seems incorrect. So I was very disturbed and also excited. So Puneet and I summarized this result before publication, circulated the result among some of my colleagues to see if they will be equally disturbed or give us some advice. And many people came back with lots of constructive criticism and advice, and to which I was very grateful. And among them were Alec White and Garnet Chan of Caltech. They went so far as to implement their own version of lambda variation benchmark. And they discovered that the textbook finite temperature perturbation theory can reproduce the lambda variation benchmarks, if and only if chemical potential mu is held fixed in both cases. So combining what they found and what we found, we can conclude that the textbook finite temperature perturbation theory is wrong, not so much mathematically as physically, since the theory does not vary chemical potential as the perturbation order is raised in order to keep the system electrically neutral at every perturbation order. Instead, the textbook theory allows the average number of electrons n bar to fluctuate, making the system a massively charged plasma. And we have seen in the third page that in such a charged plasma, energy is no longer extensive and the thermodynamics itself breaks down. Or if I put another way, the textbook perturbation theory does not converge at the exact or thermal full-CI limit unless the exact full-CI chemical potential is known in advance and it's substituted from the 0th order onwards, all the way to infinite order perturbation theory. Then it's convergent, but it defeats the purpose of perturbation theory as a converging approximation series to the exact result if you have to do full CI first. So now that we have established that finite temperature perturbation theory described in textbooks is lacking or unsatisfactory to some extent, to put it mildly, the next question is, can we arrive at the more correct finite temperature perturbation theory, which varies chemical potential, and obtain the analytical formulas? The answer is yes. And the strategy of obtaining these formulas is relatively straightforward. It's just a matter of analytically differentiating the full CI definitions. For example, the first order correction to ground potential, omega 1, is defined as a first derivative of exact omega, defined as such. And differentiating with respect to lambda, we arrive at immediately this sum over state analytical formula for omega 1. And this E parenthesis n is identified as nth order correction to energy according to the degenerate perturbation theory, which is the same as our familiar meta-pressive perturbation theory if the reference is non-degenerate. But many states which are summed over here are exactly degenerate, such as excited states, ionized states, and so on. We have to switch to a more general perturbation theory, which is this degenerate perturbation theory, which is introduced and described in this legendary paper in 1973, written by Joe Hirschfelder and Philip Certain. And this is absolutely an amazing paper. And every time I have to refer to one equation in this paper, I have to reread the whole paper from the beginning because I can never remember this logic. And this is how complicated this paper is. And it's also very, very long. So it really showed the incredible depth of intellectual perseverance of these two authors. And without this paper, I would never be able to complete this project and other projects. In any case, if you differentiate, for example, neutrality condition, we arrive at the sum over states analytical formula for mu1, and we can do the same for u1 to obtain this sum over states formula. So these formulas are numerically verified and the correct analytical formulas, but they are not the most convenient formula because we have to take the summation over all possible full CI states. So the cost of evaluating these is full CI squared, okay? Full CI cost being the full CI cost for one state. The cost is full CI squared. So the next question is, can we compress this expression into sum over orbitals expression written in terms of molecular integrals and so on? And at first glance, it seems impossible because these energies, as I mentioned, are Hirschfelder's certain general perturbation energy corrections. And they cannot be written as a closed formula in terms of molecular integrals when the reference is degenerate, because they are eigenvalues of some effective Hamiltonian matrix within the degenerate manifold. So these eigenvalues are procedurally defined, and they're not given in terms of molecular integrals as such in the case of non-degenerate reference. However, we can still write the sum of these eigenvalues in a closed formula like so, because of trace invariance. And all these eigenvalues within the degenerate manifold are summed with an equal weight because they share the same 0th order reference energy and also the same number of electrons. So it is the sum of eigenvalues that we need in order to obtain the correct number for this summation, not the individual eigenvalues. So we can still use this kind of what I call the sum rules of generate perturbation energies. And combining that with some combinatorics identities that we can derive on demand, and this is high school level mathematics, which are fun to derive, we can indeed compress this sum over states analytical expression into very short sum over orbitals reduced formulas, which are written in terms of molecular integrals. So in this way, we can obtain analytical formula for omega-1, which differs from the formulas that you can find in the textbook by this last term, which involved the first order correction to chemical potential. And in the textbook, the perturbation corrections to chemical potential is implicitly and incorrectly, in my opinion, assumed to be 0. But we have this analytical formula, which is certainly not 0. And U1 is also unknown, but we can also obtain, in the similar way, this analytical formulas. And if you evaluate these new formulas, we obtain these blue-colored numbers for omega-1, mu1, and U1, and they agree with the corresponding benchmark results. And I say this is a matter of course because these benchmark results are obtained by numerical differentiation of thermo-Fourier results. And this new analytical formula results are obtained by analytical differentiation of Fourier definition, followed by reduction, followed by substitution. Of course, they have to agree with each other if you did the mathematics and computer programming correctly. On the other hand, the textbook numbers, these red numbers, do not agree with the benchmark or this new formula. Not necessarily because their mathematics is hopeless, because if you look at this textbook formula for omega-1, it basically captures the essential part of this new formula. But rather, it is applying itself to a plasma. So it's applying to a wrong physical setting. So that's the reason why it disagrees with the correct numbers. A very similar story at second order. By analytically differentiating the Fourier definition, we arrive at this sum over states analytical formulas. And combining these with the sum rules of Hirschfelder certain generate perturbation energies, as well as additional combinatorics identities, which I call the Boltzmann identities, we can compress these expressions into reduced analytical formulas written in terms of molecular integrals. So this was the textbook formula for omega-2. And this is a new formula, which differs from the textbook formula in 2 terms. The first difference is highlighted in blue, is rather expected, going back to the original definition of omega and relationship of it to U and T and S and so on. But the second term is less expected, maybe. And mu2 formula was unknown, but following this procedure, it's tedious, but it's straightforward. It's just a matter of differentiation. We arrive at formula for mu2 as well as u2. And we can numerically verify that these formulas are correct by comparing the numbers between them. And then once again, the textbook numbers are quite off and rather useless in this context. So I'd argue that the new formula, both the sum over state and reduced formulas, are the correct formulas which underlies this correct or most satisfactory finite temperature perturbation theory, which expand omega, u, and mu on an equal footing. So having established this finite temperature perturbation theory formulas for U2, omega-2, and so on, we're in a position to come back to this original question that Cohen and Löwdin introduced, which hinted at this low temperature breakdown of this finite temperature perturbation theory. So the question is, what is the zero temperature limit of the second order correction to internal energy? Internal energy being the thermal average of all state energies. does it agree with the second order correction to energy according to the zero temperature perturbation theory? In the first glance, if the answer was no, it would be truly surprising. But it could still be no according to the analysis of these authors for degenerate ground state. So the long story short, we have these analytical formulas, and we have also have them implemented in the computer programs. So we can test this hypothesis, we can test this test by both numerical analytical methods. And here are the conclusions. The zero temperature limit of the first order correction to internal energy is MP1 energy, which is not the correct zero temperature limit for the degenerate ground state. The correct zero temperature limit is the first order correction to energy according to the Hirschfelder's certain degenerate perturbation theory, which is definitely lower than MP1 energy expression. And the second order correction to internal energy converges or divergent to negative infinity as we lower the temperature down to zero. And this certainly disagrees with the correct zero temperature limit of the second order correction for ground state energy for degenerate state, which is according to the degenerate perturbation theory, which is always finite. And we can verify these conclusions for square planar H4 numerically, which is a typical molecule with a degenerate ground state. So for example, this blue curve, the black curve is a plot of U0, zeroth order correction to internal energy, according to Fermi-Dirac theory. And Fermi-Dirac theory is perfect. It converges to the correct zero temperature limit, which is drawn as this dashed black line, even for degenerate ground state, such as H4. But the first order correction of this U1, is this blue curve, which converges to a finite limit, but it disagrees with this correct limit, which is dashed black blue line. And second order correction to internal energy, U2, is this red curve, which dives to negative infinity. And it disagrees by infinite amount from the correct zero temperature limit, which is red dashed line. So the perturbation theory breaks down and it becomes completely useless when it's supposed to be most useful at the lower temperature limit. We are hard pressed to think about the situation that we are only interested in a super high temperature and not interested at all at lower temperature. And also this temperature effect on electrons is important for degenerate cases or quasi-degenerate cases. So in wide gap insulators, the effect of temperature on electrons is null. So this theory is useless, especially for the system where this temperature effect is interesting. So this is real problem, real failure. So the next question is, can we fix this? And where does this problem come from? And unfortunately, it seems to come from the Boltzmann factor itself, which is at the heart of this thermodynamics. And this Boltzmann factor at t equals 0 is a textbook example, the prime example of the so-called non-analytic function, which is a function that is infinitely differentiable, so therefore it's completely smooth. For example, this function, u, is this black curve as a function of t. This is completely smooth, infinitely differentiable, and yet it cannot be expanded in a converging Taylor series expansion. I didn't know that there was such a function which is smooth but not expandable in the Taylor series, but now I know. And that's the ultimate origin of this problem. So if I construct this function u of t, which simulate canonical ensemble internal energy for the two-state case, and furthermore, if I set this E0 and E1, which simulate ground and excited state energies, which behave as a function of this perturbation strength lambda, like so. So at the reference, lambda equals 0, these two energies are set to be equal to each other. So this corresponds to expanding u of t, this internal energy, in a perturbation series with respect to lambda, starting with a degenerate reference. And if I did that, this u of t is always a smooth function, this black curve. Zeroth order correction and first order correction is this blue flat curve. But the second order correction is a red curve, which is divergent at t equals 0. Third order correction is even more divergent at t equals 0. If we go to a case where these two states are crossing with each other as a function of lambda, then this Taylor series expansion of u of t, the same function, which is drawn as black curve here, is convergent, but it's convergent to a wrong limit at t equals 0. Only when these two states are not crossing and also not degenerate at any point as a function of lambda from 0 to 1, then this Taylor series expansion of this simple function is convergent everywhere as a function of t, including t equals 0. So summarizing, we have established a finite temperature perturbation theory that expands omega, u, and mu on an equal footing in a time-independent algebraic derivation. And on this basis, we have found that the finite temperature perturbation theory has 0 radius of convergence at t equals 0 when the zeroth order description or reference is qualitatively wrong. And this non-convergence or even divergence is not renormalizable by adjusting chemical potential, as some of the authors suggested, including Cohen-Lödinger and Ward, because it is caused by the non-analytic nature of the Boltzmann factor itself, which is at the heart of thermodynamics. So I'm pessimistic that this problem can ever be removed within the framework of perturbation theory. So I'd like to thank a lot of people, but above all, I'd like to thank my student, Puneet Jha, who has completed this first part of this research project. And this has been funded by the United States Department of Energy. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, very impressive. It's not every day one gets the opportunity to listen to a lecture which ends up with correcting a Nobel Prize laureate.
Well, thank you for that. No, that would be a overstatement.
Yeah.
Actually, if you look at Fowler's textbook, he kind of seems like he knew the essence of the problem. For example, that in this textbook,
yes,
there are two possible reasons for this discrepancy, this Cohen-Lödinger inconsistency. One is that the unperturbed ground state may be orthogonal to the true ground state. So this corresponds to this second case that I showed in the last several pages. So Fowler seems to know, by just thinking about the problem, I suppose,
yes,
that this is one possible source of this non-convergence.
right.
He didn't mention the divergence problem that Cohen-Lödinger was hinting at, but it's possible that Cohen-Lödinger know that this was the ultimate cause.
There is a question from the audience here. Let me read. This is from a jury. It says, hi, this was very impressive and interesting. And the question is, what are the implications / applications to finite temperature coupled cluster theory?
What the relevance of what we found here to the coupled cluster theory, or?
Yes, I presume that.
If that's a question, yeah, that's a very good question. I've been thinking about this as well. I think in the sense that the coupled cluster theory is infinite order resummation of perturbation diagrams, I would imagine the same problem is inherited in the finite temperature coupled cluster theory. So depending on the reference that you use for coupled cluster expansion, you may have a non-convergence or even divergence problem at t equals 0. That's my guess.
So you're sort of saying that inherently with this is the choice of your reference, your unperturbed system.
That's correct.
I think that's
Right.
also been seen. Let's say I've been working with multi-state cos-2 methods, and we have sort of observed problems close to conical intersections, and that the selection of your reference space or your model space is extremely important in order to avoid such problems. So maybe there's a parallel. I don't know.
Yes, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, a parallel to me as well. Yeah. Thank you.
So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And now it's time for me to welcome Alain to the webinar. How are you doing, Alain? Do we have Alain there?
Yes, I am here.
Oh, no, my dear friend. How are you doing?
And I guess you can see me now, right?
Well, let's see if I can see you on the screen here. Oh, there I can see you.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay, go.
Oh, you're faking you're in the laboratory. Very impressive.
No, I mean, actually, I'll tell you guys about laboratory. That's a surprise here.
You're Toronto
so anyway,
today?
Excuse me?
Are you in Toronto today?
I am in Toronto, unfortunately, because of COVID, yes.
Okay. So it's going to be interesting to listen to your lecture here. Let's see now, we got your screen up there, yes. And you're in full screen mode. So, you know, you're going to love this when I say you have the next 40 minutes.
Thank you, Roland. It's nice to see you all. And today I'm going to try to argue for something strange at one of these Löwdin lectures, which is that we really need to meld theory and experiment to actually make an impact in chemistry. So hopefully it's not provocative too much. And the reason is very obvious. I mean, we have seen this plot many times, but I think it has to sink into us that to get to 1.5 Celsius, which is already catastrophic in many aspects in climate change because of the tails of the weather event distributions, we will need to lower our emissions by half at the middle of this decade. Let's think about that. So obviously that's not going to happen. We're going to most likely end here in the blue line, and probably even in the green line, in the gray line. We're going to have, by the end of this century, 3 degrees Celsius. So if we really needed to make a change, besides political and economic changes, the science is not there. Okay, there's not going to be a way that we're going to use theoretical chemistry to discover materials as quickly to actually try to solve some of these materials problems. That about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, led me to think about my research program. Because I've spent so far all this time thinking about how can I simulate the molecules and use even machine learning, but then gave them to an experimentalist, which, because mostly we're theoreticians in the room, I can say they're extremely traditional and extremely slow. And they take a lot of time to synthesize, and then they pass it to another experimentalist that does devices, to another experimentalist that does testing. Okay, this could be, for example, a synthetic chemist, a materials chemist, an analytical chemist. And then years later, they pass it to the industrial chemical engineers, and then later to manufacturing. The whole process usually takes 25 years. 25 years to discover solar cells, 25 years, from the discovery of solar cell to marketing, 25 years from the discovery of light emitting diodes to marketing, 25 years between the discovery of organic light emitting diodes to marketing them, okay? And hundreds of millions of dollars in development, right? So the question is, we're in the era of machine learning, high throughput computation, and robotics. Is it possible to rethink the process? I'm sorry about this phone problem. Hopefully it's only here. If not, I will restart the presentation, sorry. But what you see here is, can we actually use robotics and AI to lower it to a factor of 10? We just need a factor of 10. If instead of 25 years, it would be 2.5 years, or 10 years, 1 year, then we can make an impact to climate change. We can make an impact to technology. And is that the limit? So we're just telling us about low temperature limits in correlated models. Of course, we could also imagine lowering this even to a month and 100,000, and that would be completely transformational. So I argue that theoretical chemist has a big role in this. Okay, as a matter of fact, we need to take control of the laboratory. The laboratory has to become an extension of us. So this is a serial development process that my lab with a group of Mike Assis and Roy Gordon worked on. I don't have time to tell you the story, but we developed these organic molecules by doing screening, these organic flow batteries. And it took us 5 years and $5 million of funding to get to a stable molecule. For one side of the battery, it will take us another 5 years and $5 million to get another stable molecule for the other side of the battery. So I'm telling you that even with theoretical chemistry and machine learning and all those things, if you don't think about experiment, it takes you 10 years. This is my experience. And I'm 44 and life is very short. So we started thinking about the idea of a self-driving lab, right? The same way we do self-consistency in electronic structure, the same way we think about correcting things every time we get the new information. We have to think like Bayesianists and think about that every experimental data point, every theoretical data point has more information that can steer what is the next best experiment to make. So this is not high throughput scanning where people actually just run a bunch of calculations or run a bunch of experiments and figure out what happened. This is after every batch of experiments, updating your Bayesian model and predicting what is going to be the next best set of experiments to gain the maximum amount of information of the system. Okay, and drive it robotically so that the experimentation is faster. You don't have time for humans to do these experiments. So my lab just go into that, and that's what I'm going to tell you today. It's a compressed talk because it's 40 minutes. But with this type of ideas, there comes recognition and pressure. So this year, the MIT Technology Review recognized this idea, AI discovered molecules, as one of the 10 breakthrough technologies. I'm very proud because, of course, it's not to a person, but they mentioned 4 institutions I'm associated with, my university, my startup company, my institute, and also a company I work with. So pretty much they're saying, okay, this is the work of others and Alan, but this is kind of like some recognition that worries me, right? Same year, okay, another recognition, also mentioning our startups of paracomputing, quantum supremacy, this idea of quantum computers eventually being better than classical computers. And in my Löwdin lecture, when I gave the original Löwdin lecture, I talked about quantum computing. So today I'm not going to tell you anything about quantum computing, but that's my other research idea that I've been working on for several years, now 15 years working on quantum computing for chemistry. And I have to say that I'm also very proud that MIT Technology Review recognized it in the same year. So anyway, not bragging, let's talk about why was that recognized, or what's going on. First of all, some terminology for those of you in the room. They are not interchangeable. Machine learning and AI and all these terms are not interchangeable. There is a hierarchy of terms. And the same way when we talk about electronic structure, we need to really think about the terminology. AI can be general. You can create terminators, or shallow. We are in the era of shallow AI, where machine learning, which is defined as gaining more, improving your prediction ability by gaining more experience as experimental data comes in, okay? And it can take the form of neural networks, or it can take many other forms, much simpler forms, like random forest or other simpler models. But the idea is that after I get more points, then deep learning is nothing more than the concatenation of nonlinear activation functions, okay? You usually convolve the inputs of many of these sigmoids into more sigmoids. Also, not too much time to explain the mathematics, but to a quantum chemist, the mathematics of a neural network, it's almost like a joke. It's so simple, okay? And like us, they use automatic differentiation as one of their main tools. Okay, backpropagation, basically analytic derivatives. Okay, so one of the main discoveries in that field was analytic derivatives, which we take for granted in quantum chemistry. The good thing is they do them automatically. That's a technology that we can adopt for quantum chemistry, and Roland and I have a paper on that actually. But here. There's other areas that can help chemistry. Also, Bayesian modeling, I already mentioned it. The idea of updating your priors based on more and more information that you gain. If I have time at the end of this talk, I'll mention very briefly about that. And of course, robots. So these are the 3 tools that I am employing, or many other people as well, to try to accelerate the entire field of chemistry. And of course, this is the role of a theoretician as well as an experimentalist. And therefore, since I moved to Toronto from Harvard, now I actually have an experimental lab. And the vials that you see in the back were synthesized in my lab in 1 day. Okay, that's my background. If you saw those vials, that actually are from my lab. Okay, so now what the heck is this, right? Because people have talked about quantitative structure-activity relationships, QSAR, for a long time. And QSAR is nothing more than handcrafting features based on any molecular structure. And some of them are very esoteric, like the fourth eigenvalue of the tight binding Hamiltonian, or counting on the number of sulfur atoms, or crazy things like that. They are handcrafted. And then you make a fixed length vector x prime fit in a generalized linear model. Okay, so you will fit these coefficients of W and this shift, maybe apply a nonlinear function, and then get the output Y, which in this case will be from structure X to property Y, which is basically what we do in quantum chemistry, but now you're fitting it with some data. Okay, that's fine, and people have done this for ages in pharma and other fields. The only difference between this and machine learning is that in machine learning, you do not handcraft the features usually. Of course, you can use handcrafted features if you want, but most of the time you take the molecular representation as raw and then use more data to create your own representation. I'm going to call it here Z, or latent space vector Z. This vector Z was created by a model that contains many, many, many parameters, okay? Sometimes even millions of parameters. It's kind of strange that sometimes there are much more parameters than data points, and this is still fine. Okay, that's another strange thing about neural networks. But the point is that once you generate this vector Z, it enters this nonlinear response, and then you get the same property prediction. So ideally, we are going to gain efficiency by changing these predictive handcrafted features to these learned ones. So my first paper on this space actually was collaborating with Ryan Adams, a machine learning researcher. And David Dubenow, the first author, is now my colleague, professor of computer science at Toronto. Of course, Rafa is now a professor at MIT as well. So this was a very influential paper. It has about 1,000 citations in the Google Scholar. And what this paper did is the following. So we looked at what the molecular cheminformatics people did to represent a molecule. To use these machine learning models, you usually want to have a fixed length vector, which is problematic for us because, of course, molecular sizes are basically extensive, right? You keep adding and adding atoms. In principle, your representation should keep growing. But in these machine learning models, you usually fit the fixed length vector, so you have to convolve, right? You have to compress the data. And the way it's done in classical models from the 90s, people were looking at atoms, the nearest neighbors, the next nearest neighbors, the next nearest neighbors, and at each step of the way, generating a bit vector that is hashed with the next bit vector that contains information of the next nearest neighbors, and the hash with the next bit vector, and in some sense generating some sort of barcode for a molecule. And that's what people used as the representation to do machine learning. It's called fingerprints. Okay, think of a barcode that is generated by this hashing. So what David did that I think is brilliant is to say, let's reinterpret that as a convolutional network. Let's say that instead of having bits, now we have real numbers. Okay, and the second thing that you do is that those real numbers now contain these hidden weight matrices W at each layer that can be fitted to the data. In other words, instead of not using fixed matrices and just using randomization to do this hashing, here we actually embed the information about the model in these W weight vectors that at the end of the day give us now a real value vector. Well, what is so cool about a real value vector? That all this process that we wrote is differentiable, okay? So we have these matrix vector multiplications that turns out, of course, we know in quantum chemistry, we can differentiate. So therefore, we can actually use gradient optimization methods to do this fitting, and that's called backpropagation. So I argue for all of you that want to get into machine learning that the most important thing that you want to think about in machine learning for chemistry, okay? The most important thing is representation. The big, deep question of what is a molecule, okay? So most of the talks in this symposium probably are quantum mechanical. So you might argue philosophically, what a molecule is nothing more than the entire wave function of it. Like, as you know, for that you will require a full quantum computer to store absolutely all the possible information about a molecule. Obviously, you can machine learn from projections of it or from expectation values. You can imagine For example, looking at its electron densities or molecular orbitals or transition dipoles or excitation energies or information that comes from quantum mechanics. And that's what people usually do in this community that I'm talking to. But the people in pharma, for example, uses things called smiles, or the people in machine learning, where I am now in the field a lot, we use graphs to represent the molecules. You could also use this bag of bonds ideas, or you could use geometries, or this Coulomb matrix, of course, pioneered by one of the pioneers of this field, Anatol von Lilienfeld. So it is all in the representation, okay? For example, this is one of my favorite papers in the field, 2 years old. I love the fact that it's published in JCP, by the way. I mean, this is really cool. This is a mathematician from Chicago that does machine learning, publishing the JCP, one of our dear journals. And what this paper is doing is actually looking at the symmetries of the graph. This is something that we quantum chemists will also do. Another thing that we the quantum chemists do, and I am honored speaking after Hirata, the master of tensors, because what they did is they generalized my matrix multiplication algorithm that I told you before to a tensor algorithm, where these tensors contain the symmetric, basically symmetry adapted representation of the molecule. Okay, so basically imposing the symmetries of the graph. And what you can see here is that all of the models for the MAE and RMSE, actually quantum chemists here will also know this very well, like a real testing of our models, the same way as in quantum chemistry we do. Okay, so there's a lot of parallels between quantum chemistry and machine learning. It's part of this talk is telling them. You can see that it doesn't really matter. You can use a very crappy model like a random forest and a super sophisticated neural graph fingerprint that I just introduced, I told you before, to get more or less the same performance. But if you use the symmetries, okay, which is something more mathematical, more deep like quantum chemistry, then you get a huge reduction, okay, in the fit of this model. Okay, so I recommend you to read this paper to inspire yourself if you want to enter in the field of machine learning. How can we use technology that really looks like quantum chemistry, look at these tensor products, to really accelerate machine learning for chemistry? So now let's talk about photophysics, right? Ultimately, I am a chemist, right? And you might say, Alan, you're betraying us. You're talking about experimental chemistry. But ultimately, I'm a quantum chemist. So let me tell you about my work of 4 years ago. A little bit of organic photophysics. You probably know all of these, you guys here in this room and gals. The triplets are usually non-radiatively decaying to the ground state because they overlap with the ground state, and the spin orbit coupling basically doesn't allow you to considerably emit light back to the singlet. Also, there's not the possibility of thermal activation because the gap is usually way larger than KT. Okay? So if you actually introduce transition metals for this light emission process, of course, you mix the singlet and the triplet via relativity, and therefore the singlet borrows characteristics of the triplet, and therefore it can emit light with this mixed quantum state. The problem is that metal-containing emitters degrade, and therefore your cell phones only contain emitters for the low band gap, red and green, but not for the blue. Okay, and it is because there's no blue emitter with transition metals that withstands the operation conditions of a light emitting diode. Shikai Arachi came with a revolution, and this all has to do with quantum mechanics. Can we reduce the exchange energy? Okay, you remember the gap between the singlet and the triplet can be approximated as twice the exchange energy. And we know how to do that with quantum mechanics. Can we reduce exchange energy so that the gap between the singlet and the triplet is around KT, and therefore they're quasi-degenerate, and therefore we have this reverse intersystem crossing and emit light? Around 2014, there were not many molecules known in the world that did this, okay, that were good emitters, high oscillator strength, but also had this property. So my lab published 2 years later in this Nature Materials paper a workflow that allowed us to go from 1 million molecules down selected to 100,000 run by quantum chemistry. We use machine learning to sample the rest of the space, and we were able to look at 1 million molecules, filter down with voting with experimental chemists, and then synthesize and test and make 40 molecules and 3 champion devices. So we predicted 3 new state-of-the-art molecules, many more, but we made 3 state-of-the-art molecules demonstrated in an OLED device. Enough for Nature Materials. So we were very proud of that, but we really didn't move the needle of Samsung because experimentation is so freaking slow, right? I mean, we were able to calculate millions of molecules, but only make 40. spending millions of dollars. So it's a problem, okay? So we really need to think deeply about this problem. Like our prediction ability is actually blocked by experiment. So now I want to switch into another type of idea of machine learning called generative models. But for that, let me use a story from Blade Runner. You might recall that in Blade Runner, Deckard is an android that is trying to kill Blade Runners. And the Blade Runners could be humans or androids. Okay, I'm missing a slide. Okay, I'm sorry. So in this particular case, this android Deckard, okay, has to look at Barry and decide if he's this Blade Runner has to look at Barry and decide if he's a human or an android. And that problem is classification, right? If you see a sample and you say good or bad, that's kind of like a regression or a classification. And that's what I just told you the entire talk so far. The entire talk has been about giving structure, give me a property, which, by the way, is basically how quantum chemistry mostly works, right? This is basically even the same. I have quotes from Samuel Boyce saying that, quantum chemistry is the idea of taking a chemical question and getting an answer. He's implicitly saying, give me an XYZ file and I'll give you an energy. Okay, so that is just the same discriminative models. But there's something really cool about what this android has to do to fool the human. He has to generate human behavior. He has to sample from a PDF and do behavior that looks like a human, move, pick his nose, scratch his head, do things that look like a human. Okay. Oh, these slides are all messed up. I apologize. So this was my classification between androids and humans. But guess what? That generation, okay, I apologize for messing up my slides. That generation of data is called, oh my God, I have a mess here. That generation of data is called generative model, okay? Can you guys see this well? Roland, is my screen seen correctly?
Alain?
Yes.
Yeah, we see the whole. You're not in full screen mode, but we see the slide with the generative mode. No, now the full screen disappeared. Oh,
okay, can you?
Yes,
can you guys
perfect. Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, I really apologize.
That's fine.
So what is a generative model? Okay, a generative model is like Monte Carlo. It generates the joint probability distribution. So we have used generative models all our career. If we know how to do Monte Carlo, we know the Boltzmann distribution, and we're sampling from the Boltzmann distribution new snapshots that, of course, were not in the training set, that are snapshots of the thermal distribution. So you might say, Alain, what is new in machine learning? What the heck is new? Okay. Well, what is new is that people can do this, okay? Instead of Boltzmann distributions that, we know how to sample, imagine that you don't know anything about the model. For example, I give you pictures of people. So you're going to take these pictures of people, okay, and generate a database of people that do not exist. These three faces here that to me look very realistic, you might see some problems. For example, this girl has a very weird finger here. And there's also, maybe she's missing a ear. There's some things that that are not perfectly right. But these are computer-generated faces, and you probably have heard a lot about it from the news. Okay, it's very popular. So we were kind of the first group in the world that actually said, is this technology useful for chemistry, these generative models? And published this paper that I think still is my favorite paper in my career almost, okay? So in this paper, we said, let's use a generative model to actually generate molecules with desired properties. So let me explain to you how this works. This is a very strange neural network. It's called an autoencoder. Let's think what that means. An autoencoder is a technology that actually, the name comes from communications theory. Is you compress and decompress information. Of course, something that we do in quantum chemistry too. Quantum chemistry, I argue, is nothing more than compressing wave functions. You have the entire Hilbert space and you compress it in a model, like a mean field model, or compress it in a tensor network, or compress it with a couple cluster ansatz. All of that we do really is compressing a very large Hilbert space, and as Rudenberg likes to say, filtering out the chaff of the Hilbert space. So here we're doing the same thing with information, okay? So we have this channel of information that compresses this molecular string, a very strange object, a string that represents a molecule, into a 200 differentiable space Z. Remember that space Z I told you about? I'm going to have a vector that is about 200-dimensional real numbers that basically maps this discrete space graphs, in this particular case, the string representation, to actually at a point in 200 dimensions. And there's a lot of dimensionality reduction methods. You can do it one way. But what is super sexy about autoencoders is that they force a neural network to reproduce that point again. So really what you train is, say, in about 250,000 molecular structures from PubChem, you train a reversible model that can go from molecule to molecule through this compressed representation. So maybe this compressed representation has some information about chemical space. We wonder. So we added a third neural network, that was our innovation, that actually links to a molecular property. In other words, this 200-dimensional space, if you walk on it, same way we do gradient optimization in quantum chemistry, and we do SEF and these kind of things, you could move and maximize the molecular properties or property that you want, backtrack into this region of the space, and decode which is the molecule that corresponds to that particular property. So we're proud. We put this paper in the archive in 2016, and this is now a cottage industry. Machine learning people, pharma people, materials people, all of them are working on these autoencoders and these generative models, GANs. So just to show you why we got this technology review recognition in silico, Kevotics, my group, etc. The reason is because in silico AI, did a challenge. They said, let's actually line up everything and try to do a compressed drug discovery project. Let's just start with an autoencoder. You can see here the technology I just told you about that we introduced to the world. The chemistry version. Of course, autoencoders existed since the 90s. Okay, but you take an autoencoder and you apply it to chemistry and use a bunch of pharmaceutical filters. This is extremely important. Use a lot of humans to actually do cell cultures, animal experiments. And in 46 days, we were able, with Alex leading this, and I'm just more of a consultant in this project in some sense, this was done at a startup, to design 3 potent DDR1 kinase drug candidates in 46 days. So you see, this is not just bullshit. Actually, you can generate molecules, okay? Of course, this is not a drug. This is a drug candidate, etc. Since then, with Yu-Sung Jung, another quantum chemist that used to be with me in the group of Head Gordon as office mates, now he's a professor at KAIST, and so this is mostly work done in his group, and I am helping him. We generated now solid-state structures. For those solid-state people, these are 4 new phases of vanadium that could exist at an energy above the convex hull that could be totally stable for a new phase. These we are the same way as the phases that I told you about, generated by the computer without you not knowing them before. We trained with about 10,000 data points, and then we generated more data points, like Monte Carlo. And these low energy points that we generate turn out to be potential new phases of vanadium oxide. Okay? And Impress in Nature Machine Intelligence is going to come out, my most complex paper on this space. This is actually MOFs. So to do a MOF is extremely complicated because this is not really a solid, this is not really a molecule. You have to encode the graphs, representation of the molecule. You have to encode the topology of this crystal, okay? And then you have to be able to encode it into this latent space and then decode it. And we showed in this paper that it's in the Chem archive, but you can also see in Nature Machine Intelligence when it comes out in a few weeks, that we are able to predict MOFs that are very selective and very good for the properties that we wanted, like these separating gases, with molecules that are kind of like those phases that you generated, molecules that have never been used in a MOF, okay? And with geometries, perhaps could be done. And the question is, of course, can somebody really make these materials? So I'm going to do a time check, Roland. How much time do I have for speaking? And then to minus the questions. How much time do I have left?
So it's 16:08, and I've set you up so you could keep on speaking another 10 minutes, and then we would have 5 minutes for questions.
Fantastic. So then I'm going to skip more machine learning stuff, and I'm going to move to the robots in the next 10 minutes, Roland. Okay, so let's make a pause. I talk too fast. I am a Spanish speaker, and I like to tell you many things. That's my style. So maybe you want to pause a little bit. Now let's talk about the second part of my dream. So I just told you right now the molecules dream in molecules, but I told you it's not enough. We need to do experiment. So let's talk about what we've been doing in experiments. we worked on a report, okay, called on this topic of materials acceleration platforms, okay. That's something that also I talked a lot and worked a lot with Roland, actually, thinking about how can we accelerate discovery. Okay, we have a paper, Roland and I, and Marcus, that is also here, okay, on some of these ideas, by the way, in ACS Central Science. I forgot to put it here. Sorry, I removed the slide. But the point is here that all of these ideas of incorporating robotics and chemistry, right, and with Marcus, we also wrote about computer vision and others, could potentially accelerate experiments. And here are some of the references you can read about this. I don't have too much time. But now here goes my experimental piece, okay? I brought these crazy people. If you follow them in Twitter, Lee Cronin is a character, okay? Marty Burke, also a very flamboyant person, Jason Hine, and myself, I'm wearing a purple shirt today, okay? So we got together these crazy people, okay? And we said, let's make chemical robots for real. But they are all going to be controlled by computers. There's going to be an ontology, a compiler, right? Let's transform organic chemistry from an art to a science, okay? In some sense, let's transform organic chemistry so that we control every aspect of it. And this is going to be my next, next 10 years of my career, at least, right? So what technology we decided to develop? Organic lasers. We decided to develop a technology that basically is very futuristic. But you might wonder, how are we going to make the molecules? And then we have to learn from biology. In our body, we make the molecules by iterative coupling schemes. We iteratively couple amino acids, nucleosides, saccharides, or even, of course, terpenes to create most of the biomolecules. So Marty Burke is a leader in saying that you can perhaps do most of organic chemistry with a single reaction. Maybe this is the most striking comment I'm going to say here to you theoreticians. The organic chemists have been lying to us, okay? They can do most of the organic chemistry with more complex fragments with just a single iterative coupling scheme, where you do carbon-carbon coupling, and then you can see here a bunch of materials and a bunch of drug molecules that Marty and others have shown can be done if you automate and robotize just this very simple step of protection, deprotection with these metaboronase. I mean, this is not an organic chemistry talk, but what we're doing is combining that idea with, of course, photophysics. In an organic laser, you have to do all these photophysical problems. You have to minimize lifetimes, maximize absorption, minimize the overlap of absorption and emission, of course, minimize inter-system crossing. And for this, you can have all sorts of Jablonski models, parabolas, etc., that allow you to predict, and we know how to predict in quantum chemistry these processes. Okay, so my lab is good at doing all that, so we also are good at doing that. So this project is, by the way, called Madness. And of course, for that, you need a database. Quantum chemists, I'm not going to dwell too much in databasing. The new thing about databasing here is we database also all the experimental data together. So now there's no such thing as a theory or experiment. This is just a single lab. So I'm going to skip a couple of the things that we do, but what we do that matters is that we create a space of synthetically reachable molecules with AI. All of the molecules that we screen are makeable by our robot, okay? And then we down select and search the space with quantum chemistry. What do we do for quantum chemistry? We do path integral calculations. You guys know about them. We fully transform the correlation function. We get the absorption and emission spectra. So that allows us to calculate the fluorescence emission rates. If we add more parabolas, we haven't, but if we add more parabolas, we could do non-reactive, or more matrix elements, we can do non-reactive relaxation. We can add another parabola for the triplets. So we know, of course, how to extend our photophysical model with all the beautiful work many people in this room have done over their career. We have Martin Quack sitting here and many others in quantum dynamics that have done this work for us. Like, I'm just using their work. I'm standing in the shoulders of giants to just do these predictions. So I'm also standing in the shoulders of giants of computational chemists. I'm using here traditional state TDDFT calculations that many people in this room spent a lot of time in optimizing, for example, including Roland as well, okay? But, and then using semi-empirical methods to approximate them. So all of this is not so perhaps familiar to you. So the computational piece is familiar, right? So, so what maybe is more crazy for you is, okay, how we do the experiments? Well, we're using machine learning to look at the reaction conditions and prediction of what happens when you actually do this. So for us, all of these are variables that we can throw in our machine learning models. Temperature, concentrations, reaction conditions. These are real fragments that we calculate their electronic structure, but also couple in virtually. And my lab literally has an organic chemistry piece, this synthetic robot, an analytical chemistry piece, this mass spec, and these three lasers operating to calculate PL filtration, excited state absorption, and emission and absorption. So we have an organic chemistry, an analytical chemistry, and a physical chemistry lab in the same room, right? You can see here the organic chemistry piece, and you can see why a theoretical chemist is so excited. For us, this is like a GPU, right? So we're programming these and telling it to open the vessels and add the chemicals, and so it is not surprising that a quantum chemist that likes to write code would like to write the code that we wrote called ChemOS, right? A code that allows us to actually carry out these operations. And of course, we're learning all the problems experimentalists have. Handling powders is extremely hard. So this is the finickiest thing, and we have to debug it the same way you debug a computer program, just debugging how the heck are we going to dispense powders efficiently, and so on. But you see, one of the lessons I learned is organic chemistry is accessible to theoretical chemists if we do this, right? I don't recommend you to do it by hand. But of course, you have to hire good postdocs and all that. I don't know how to do this myself. But here we have the organic chemistry lab, the HPLC, and the lasers, all of them in the same place. These are measured absorption and PL of molecules that I'm going to show you. So we have closed the loop. We can make the molecules, separate them, characterize them with this robotics, and measure them. So this lab is working. These 40 molecules you see in the background of my talk were done a few weeks ago. Of course, it's not the full production yet. I have only been in Toronto for 2 years, but now all the pieces are working. Okay, so I'm going to end, okay, telling you a little bit about the mathematics, perhaps, of how we do this. For experimental conditions, we use these Bayesian models, and we have published these 3 papers here. They're called Phoenix, Chimera, and Griffin in Central Science, Chemical Science, and this one was submitted. Basically, that do either continuous or categorical or discrete variables. If you optimize a discrete variable, you have to relax it into this simplex, and actually basically optimize the continuous variable here, and then see which is the closest corner. Okay. This chimera is basically a way of gluing different objectives that the organic chemist wants into a single function. All of these things we do because we're quantum chemists. We know how to do this. We do mathematics, so we know how to do these things. Okay. So I'm going to really end by showing you that we have used this in experiment. This paper was already in the Chem archive. In Merck, we optimized this reaction. Okay, we optimized with that technology, this organic reaction. And you can see this reaction in action, okay? You can see this robot here doing the organic chemical reaction, and you can see all the different data being collected, and our optimizer literally optimizing the chemical reaction and achieving beyond human capability only with 200 experiments. And I know Roland is probably standing up there saying, Alan, you're running out of time. So I am done. I'm just gonna, I'm really spent a lot of time. Maybe this is the last slide. Just one last point. Let me tell you that, of course, I am a chemist, okay? I'm a physical chemist. You have to stay a physical chemist. You cannot just do this and forget your origins. Remember this. The question that we had is, are there orbital symmetries that allow us to put the triplet above the singlet? Is it possible to have a molecule that has a triplet above the singlet and be bright? Piotr da Silva has a beautiful paper that shows molecules that have a triplet above the singlet, but not exactly the triplet above the singlet, but not bright. We were able to use machine learning and screening to find a new generation of molecules that use this core to invert the singlet and the triplet, but borrow oscillator strength from these pieces here to be bright. And this is what I like to call the 5th generation OLED. So you can use your photophysics and your quantum chemistry to do new materials. And now the idea is, of course, how to synthesize this in the robot and create a technology that you have not seen before. And with that, I'm going to open for questions. This is my group before COVID. And thank you for your attention. I know I crammed a lot of information.
Thank you very much, Alan. Very impressive what you're doing. I must first say I was impressed by the robotics you demonstrated. I remember last time you demonstrated robotics for me. I think it could do a tequila sunrise for me.
Exactly. Now we can do full organic chemistry.
Yes.
2 years later.
Yeah,
So you have to visit.
Yeah. So you have been developed far. I saw also a paper about the IBM is working on this, and it actually turned out that the technician on the picture was an Italian guy that was up in Lund some 10 years ago, working with me on coding up the non-adiabatic coupling terms to investigate conical intersections. Also, I have some bad news for you. So you suggested using the acronym MADNESS.
I know that there is a code MADNESS. I know there is a code of Robert Harrison.
Yes.
I stole it.
Yes. So multi-resolution adaptive numerical scientific simulations. So you have to rethink that one, I think.
Okay. Or give credit to Robert. I mean, there can be two MADNESS, right? One experimental, one theoretical.
Sure.
Anyway, yes.
So there's a question here from the audience, and I really don't know if it's a question or not. Let's see. Excellent lecture, Professor Alan, Orlando writes. In predicting thinking machine models, there is room for the chance, that is, discoveries that occur through uncontrolled modifications of variables. I think the question is if there is. Because in real life, a classical example would be the by chance discovery of penicillin, right?
Okay, Orlando, this is an excellent question because the next paper, I just haven't edited it. I have the last version from my group, and I haven't just gone through the English again one more time and some typos and things like that. But we're gonna put in days in the archive a paper on using a technology from machine learning called curiosity-driven exploration.
Oh.
Okay. Turns out that people in machine learning created these machine learning models for video game playing. So when you're playing video games and you want to solve a video game in the computer, if you just repeat what you're doing, you're not going to find anything new.
Right.
So they look for places with high entropy for new stuff. So we just did it for searching molecular space. So in other words, if you're seeing boring stuff, your model starts not looking at the boring stuff and trying to find new stuff. So I argue we will be able to use that to discover new penicillins. Very soon, my robot will go into discovery mode and we'll find new reactions. And Lee Cronin already has found new reactions with his robot. So very good question, Orlando. That's where we're going.
So just out of curiosity, how do you classify boring things?
We are theoreticians, right? What the model is doing is looking for regions of high entropy, for example, or regions that are orthogonal, projecting out all the previous things you saw. So we could use projectors, and we could also use the entropy of our observations to actually guide us towards high entropy regions. So there's mathematical foundations that, if you were to see the papers, are basically very easy for us theoretical chemists to understand and use.
I have a final question here. So you said to develop your research, you're in the hands of really hiring the very best postdocs that are around. And what you're depicting here is something we hope is going to be the normal industrial research and development environment. In that respect, when should the universities start to train engineers that have all these skills we need them to have? Isn't that the next bottleneck?
Roland, and you and I wrote this paper with Marcus, and we mentioned that in it's one of the 6 things we mentioned in our paper together. Education is so important. Well, let me tell you guys, I'm very proud to announce this too. So one of the nice things also of moving to Canada for me was that, well, the university is helping me a lot, right? I mean, it's kind of like, oh, we stole this guy from Harvard. So one of the nice things that they allowed me to do is to create a university initiative that we are launching in January called the Acceleration Consortium. where one of the big elements of this initiative, this is the first time I direct something, so I'll be the director, so I'm not going to teach. Awesome, I'm just going to run this thing. But what I'm going to do in that initiative is a master's program and an accelerated training program for the first material scientists that are trained in experimental and theoretical and computational machine learning methods in an accelerated 2-year period, very practical, so that they go out to industry and to other labs and do chemistry, okay? So that's one of my big goals, is to actually train people. And I argue many universities should actually start having these organic chemistry labs this way. I also
completely.
argue that we theoretical chemists have to stay out of our cocoon and go talk to our organic colleagues and see how we can help them really.
Indeed.
Have fun. It's actually really fun.
Yeah. Very good. I've been asked by some of the attendants here if these lectures going to be available, and yes, we're going to make all of the presentations which have been recorded, and all of them are being recorded, available at this website at a later date. Also, in the chat, Alan, do you share your slides with us?
Absolutely. I'm going to make a nice PDF and I'll put it on the chat as a link for Nuga, Rohan Man, Andres.
Put it in the chat for everybody. We can cite you in the future.
No problem. Nura wants them, and absolutely. I'll just put it during the next presentation. I just put the link. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor. It was an honor to become a Löwdin lecturer, and it's an honor to come back and share the stage with these amazing luminaries.
It was a pleasure having you here. Thank you very much. With that, we move on to the third presentation for this fifth session, which is Martin Quack from ETH in Zurich. Martin, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Let's see if I can get a picture of you, camera. Oh, there you are. Hello, sir.
You hear me? Yes.
Indeed, I do. And I think you're sharing your screen already. Perfect. Yes. And you're going in full screen mode there too. So I'm leaving the audience to you for the next 40 minutes. Does that sound all right?
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So thank you again for organizing this, Roland. This is my first visit in virtual space to Uppsala. A very interesting experience, but I have been in Uppsala before, in real space. Now, talking about molecules in motion, before I go into details, I should perhaps remind you of the abstract book. The abstract book has something that you shouldn't read now, but it has some references. In making this lecture, I decided that I will actually present sort of no details. I will concentrate on the concepts and some of the results. And if you want details and many equations, go to the references in the abstract books, and there you'll find everything. Now, I mentioned that it's not my first visit to Uppsala. My first visit in real space was in 1973 in one of the summer schools of Per Olaf, and actually that picture was given to me by Dave Yarkoni and Barbara Garrison. They are not speaking at the meeting, but perhaps they are in the audience. Here you see Per Olaf. Actually, the circles were made by Dave Yarkoni. You see Dave Yarkoni here. Some of you know the picture in Uppsala, I guess. That's what it looked like in 1973. Here's Barbara Garrison. Here you see me. Actually, I seem to be distracted by looking at this nice statue there. Now, I came back later for the Löwdin lecture in 1996. This is actually the program for the Löwdin lecture, and I should congratulate Nancy Macrae and Tom Miller for giving the 2020 Löwdin lectures. I look forward, I enjoyed very much Nancy's lecture yesterday and look forward to Tom's lecture today. Now, at that time, in 1996, we were 3 lecturers, and each of us gave 2 lectures over 2 days. And actually, the topic of my first general lecture was closely related to what I talk about today. And in fact, here you have a picture of the 1996 Löwdin lectures. You heard actually yesterday Franco Gianturco. I'm not sure whether Peter Fulde is around in the audience. And this picture is taken from actually an article which was in a volume, in one of 3 volumes, a tribute to the memory of Per Olof Löwdin, published in 2004. And actually in this article, you find some of the ideas of my Löwdin lecture in 96, and also actually a memory, souvenirs from my various visits to Uppsala in the past, and of Per Olof Löwdin, who was actually a truly wonderful teacher and person to many of you. Now, getting to more pictures to give acknowledgement. This is my group a number of years ago, but it has the main people contributing to what I'm talking about. Sigi Albert, Georg Seifang, Lubos Horny, theory, Edward Miller-Kriakov, laser experiments, Andreas Schneider, chemistry, Daniel Zindel, Andreas Schneider, electronics, Daniel Zindel, chemistry, and Shaba Fabre, and Chichu Chen, theory and spectroscopy, and Irina Bolotova. There are new members that are not on the picture, and these are actually ones that still work with me today. That is Karen Kepler and Gunter Wichmann. And I should also acknowledge the funding, the Swiss National Science Foundation in the past, the ERC Advanced Grant, ETH Zurich, and our laboratory. An article that is recent, where you find actually some of the details of my lecture, is in 2020 by Georg Seifang and Gunter Wichmann as co-authors, and these are the ones who contribute currently to our experiments. Another thing that is recent published, where you can find more details, is with a former graduate student who is now a professor in Strasbourg on molecular spectroscopy and quantum dynamics. And you can find articles by a number of authors there, and I highly recommend that you get this in your library or for you personally. So what about the content of my lecture? I will tell a little bit about recent progress in fundamental aspects of intramolecular primary processes, and I will start with some introductory comments on why we study molecular quantum motion applications and concepts, and of course symmetry and conservation laws. Then I will briefly just tell a little bit about the experimental approaches. Of course, the Löwdin lecturers have only a minority of experimentalists, but some they are. And then I will talk about approximate symmetries and timescales, surprising superposition states that I have summarized probably into one slide, and the current frontier, which is electroweak parity violation. So why do you study? Actually, we just in the previous lecture had one application that is, of course, we want to understand, for instance, atmospheric chemistry. And one of our previous projects where intramolecular quantum dynamics was important and spectroscopy was in the Alliance for Global Sustainability, which is here. The idea of having a spectroscopic measurement and management of the Earth's atmosphere. But of course, they are also related to reaction dynamics and statistical theory, coherent laser, multiphoton excitation, coherent control, laser isotope separation, of course, very high resolution spectroscopy in general, and kinetics of primary processes. The topic that is currently of interest in our research are actually approximate and fundamental symmetries, astrophysical spectroscopy, chiral molecules, and parity violation. I will come to that. Now, why would you be interested in abstract conservation laws in chemistry, symmetry violations, and in particular parity violation in chiral molecules? Well, firstly, symmetries, and I will discuss that, allow us to generate a classification scheme and understanding for a wide range of primary processes in chemistry, physics, biophysics, and biochemistry. And also, as to symmetries, there are some fundamental open questions that we need to address. If you look at kinetics, we have two important types of primary processes. You all know that, of course. One is going over a barrier thermally, let's say, and you can use a transition state expression for the rate constant. And of course, that can be calculated by quantum chemistry. There's actually no dynamics whatsoever in that expression. It's all entirely statistics. If you want to have dynamics, this becomes important when you have a rate limiting vibrationally energy flow. I will not discuss this point today. The second way to do a reaction is go through the barrier by the tunnel effect, as discovered by Friedrich Löwdin in 1927. And these processes can become very slow indeed. And there's another slow process, which I will discuss today, that is parity violation, the change of parity in time. That is also a very slow process on the order of seconds. This is a very broad survey of the discovery of many islands in the ocean of time, as I like to call it, that happen actually by various types of symmetry breaking. You look at intramolecular energy flow in alkyl CH. This happens on a femtosecond time scale. Acetylenic CH is much slower, a big surprise in the old days. This big difference, it's 100 picoseconds. Hydrogen bond rearrangements, tunneling, stereo mutation, selective energy transport through CC bonds, all of this is experimental results. And finally, today we come to parity change, where we so far have not yet a successful experiment. Now, all of these results were obtained what I would call by the alternative approach to molecular dynamics and fundamental physics, which is from high-resolution spectroscopy. We could achieve a number of things with this. Already in '86, we had a time resolution by this technique that could be claimed to be 200 attoseconds. It's the first multidimensional quantum wave packet in '86. The first multidimensional, full-dimensional tunneling stereo mutation was derived that way for hydrogen peroxide. Ongoing theory and possible parity violation. And actually, the currently most sensitive proposed test is based on this approach for CPT violation. How does it work? Well, you start from molecular spectra, high resolution, as I mentioned, without time resolution or a very slow time resolution, Fourier transform spectroscopy, laser spectroscopy, you have symmetry selection rules. And from there, you get what we call the effective Hamiltonian. These are the many constants of spectroscopy that you find in tables. And from there, you have to do a further step to get the true molecular Hamiltonian. And with that, you get actually the time evolution operator and molecular kinetics. You could do the whole process. This is by experiment. You could do also the process by theory. The difficulty in theory is that so far, it simply is not as accurate and accurate enough to compete with high-resolution spectroscopy. I can use this also to illustrate one point that leads often to a misunderstanding. Often what people say, you can read this in textbooks and also it's often told at meetings, well, if you want to get time evolution, you just Fourier transform the spectrum. This is actually quite wrong. We measure often the Fourier transform of the spectrum in the first place as an experimental result. And in fact, then we transform it, Fourier transform it to get the true spectrum. And then you need all this analysis. Without the analysis, you do not get the quantum dynamics. And this is actually a summary of what is the essence of the analysis to get time-dependent dynamics. It basically has a very simple idea. If you write the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, you can get a solution for an isolated molecule, let's say, in terms of an infinite sum like this, a time-dependent wave function with the eigenenergies and the eigenstates. And if you are able to analyze and understand a spectrum over a certain frequency range, let's say over 15,000 centimeters minus 1, this is a realistic case that we have achieved, and you understand these wave functions from the analysis and the energy levels, then you can claim actually and obtain time-dependent processes down to 200 attoseconds. You can revert this picture if you are interested in extremely high energy resolution. you can do this by looking at slow processes that are symmetry violations. And by this, we can achieve a resolution of 100 atto-electron volt or 10 to the minus 12, 10 to the minus 1. That's the goal today. Now, sometimes people say, how can that be that you have no time resolution in your experiments and you get, nevertheless, a time-dependent process? Well, if you think about doing time-dependent kinetics, which we also do, of course, what you do is, in the best case, you compare a process that you measure in time, an observable, with a clock. And of course, the clock we use today is an atomic and molecular clock. And that is nothing else but a two-level representation of this solution. So if you take two levels in the cesium clock, let's say, you just get the period of the cesium clock, which defines a second, and by reference to this, you measure your time-dependent processes. And what we do is simply the same, just working in the energy space. If you think a little bit more deeply about time, of course, clocks are nothing but comparing different motions. This is an idea that goes back to Aristotle. And of course, the old time measurement was based on planetary motion. This is a sundial picture taken by a former postdoc, now professor in Lyon. And the today's picture, this is a graphical representation of the atomic clock. Basically, it's a complex phase factor of the two-level Schrödinger equation. It goes around according with positive time around like this. The cesium clock goes around one circle in a tenth of a nanosecond about. And of course, with this, you can measure time extremely precisely. Just to remind, the first accurate clock to measure seconds for astronomical measurements was built in 1625. And you see this clock, built by Jost Bürgi, had actually three hands, one for the hour, one for the minute, and one for the second. In the new SI, of course, the second is defined through the cesium atomic clock. Well, I will not go to details in the spectroscopy. If you want to know more about that, look at the Handbook of High Resolution Spectroscopy. And the approach that we are working on today is to get a resolving power of 2 times 10 to the 15, meaning 10 to the minus 12 centimeters minus 1 accuracy, which allows us to measure very small symmetry violations. Just one picture of a current instrument that is still the currently highest resolution worldwide instrument for FTIR spectroscopy at the Swiss Light Source in Switzerland. It gets 16 megahertz, which is not a superb resolution, but the advantage of Fourier transform is, of course, to get an extremely broad frequency range all at the same time. Now let's come to the basic idea of the theoretical analysis. If you look theoretically at time-dependent processes, molecular quantum dynamics, you can do that with the Schrödinger equation. Of course, you can write the solution of the Schrödinger equation in this way, with the time evolution operator. And this provides you with time-dependent wave functions, and the wave functions provide you with time-dependent observed properties that you can see. You can turn around that question. Instead of asking for the changes in time in that system, you can ask what remains constant. And of course, we know that these are the constants of motion. The constants of motion commute with the Hamiltonian, and in the well-known one-line proof of Löwdin, you have the C of 2, you take the Heisenberg equation of motion, and you see immediately that they don't change in time, even though, of course, the molecular system has a lot of possibly very fast changes. So symmetry helps us to look at changes by concentrating at the opposite of what is conserved, what is simple and doesn't decay. Now, that might be the end of the story, but you can go beyond this now by splitting up your Hamiltonian in various parts which have different constants of the motion, different groups of the Hamiltonian. A part that has a very large contribution has a group G of H0. The second part, a smaller symmetry group, G of H1, and you go on like this. And now this allows you to concentrate on contributions just of these symmetry violating terms. So what this separation and looking at constants of the motion allows us is to get to weigh what I call the captain directly without the ship. And in our work, the captain corresponds to an energy of 100 atto-electron volt. This is what we can do today, at least in test experiments. And the molecular energies that are concerned are on the order of an electron volt. So we bridge 16 orders of magnitude. So that's the idea behind the analysis that we are doing. And you can do that, of course, without bridging such a large gap. This would be the current frontier. We have used this on smaller gaps. If you look at molecular motion as a system of uncoupled oscillators, all the quantum numbers of all the vibrations are, of course, constants of the motion. And the symmetry is broken by anharmonic interaction. And that happes on timescales of femtoseconds, typically going up to picoseconds and even nanoseconds in some cases. Then you have another symmetry that is nuclear spin symmetry. You can separate rotation, vibration, and nuclear spin states. That conserves nuclear spin symmetry, and you can have violation of nuclear spin symmetry. And these processes happen on nanoseconds to milliseconds. And we have many examples. These are all examples from our group, but there are many more from the literature. All of these processes, we have numerous experimental examples by now. The current frontier is a parity violation, where we have theory, but no experiment yet so far anywhere in the world. And you can go beyond. If you look at time reversal symmetry, we don't even have a quantitative theory yet, although we know that the process exists in principle. From high energy physics, it's measured in K-meson decay. And of course here we have hypothetical CPT violation that has not been seen anywhere so far in physics. So one way to look at these symmetry violations is to prepare surprising superposition isomers. I cannot go into much detail of this, where these superposition isomers have a well-defined symmetry, which is then violated by the symmetry violating terms in the Hamiltonian. And one question is, can we prepare superposition isomers, for instance, of nuclear spin isomers? And the answer is yes, we can. There is a myth among spectroscopists and others that one cannot do this. You can find a number of papers in the literature, but in fact, one can do that. Can we prepare superposition of structural isomers? So molecules of different structure, cis and strands and so forth. And we have demonstrated, yes, we can that do too. I have no time. And this can actually be used to make molecular switches as a basis for quantum technology. I will have to skip this too. And then further, can we prepare superpositions of enantiomers of chiral molecules? And this is the topic that I get to now. So let me get to quantum chemistry, as you all do it, of course, here. That can be based on a famous statement by Dirac in 1929. It's one of the most quoted sentences, and you all have seen this before. It says, the underlying physical laws for the mathematical theory of a large part of physics and the whole of chemistry are thus completely known. And the difficulty is only, and then he continues. And he says, it therefore becomes desirable that approximate practical methods of applying quantum mechanics should be developed. And that's, of course, what we all do as quantum chemists, if we do. But the real point is that this statement up here is wrong. There was a thing in chemistry that is important that Dirac and nobody else at the time could know, that was parity violation. And we know that electroweak parity violating quantum chemistry introduces fundamentally new aspects. And as a little note to Pekka Pikko, who yesterday said so nicely that electromagnetic quantum electrodynamics is the last train from physics to chemistry, actually that is a parity conserving train. And in fact, electroweak quantum chemistry is a later train from physics to chemistry. And this is what we look for. A brief history of this. If you look at that, it started with the discovery of parity violation in high energy and nuclear physics. Names are Li, Yang, Wu, Chopper, Friedman, Telekti, Lederman, and so forth in 56, 57. Then resulting from this, there was a development of the standard model of particle physics, now the modern theory of microscopic matter. Quantitative theory for atoms and molecules was done in the 70s and 80s. It turned out that the molecular theory was still wrong by orders of magnitude, and no time to discuss this in detail. And we developed an accurate theory in the 90s, and in the meantime, this has been confirmed by many theory groups. To show you the big jump that happened in the 90s in this field, this is actually the pre-1995 theory for hydrogen peroxide, and it jumped by a factor of 100, and now it stabilizes in work of many groups on the new values. Now you may ask, where does this parity violating term in molecules come from? And this is a way to look at molecular Hamiltonians in the standard model. You all know, of course, that you put the Coulomb potential into your calculations. I wonder how many really ask themselves the questions, where does the Coulomb potential come from? How does it arise? Is it given there in space? And the answer is, of course, not. In the standard model, the Coulomb potential arises by an exchange of photons between the particles. So two electrons know that they have to repel each other by throwing, in a sense, photons at each other. And the picture that I like at the CERN website is this with two ladies on two boats. They throw a ball, and if you don't see the ball, that's a field particle, then you see only the acceleration, and you can interpret that acceleration by the Coulomb force, and that leads then to the repulsion of the two electrons. The similar thing happens with the big nuclear force now. There, the field particle is in fact the Z boson that does the parity violation. The Z boson is a strange beast. It was discovered at CERN in 1983. And of course, at that time, people wouldn't have thought that it would be important for chemistry, but actually it is. It has a mass of 100 atomic units, about 98 Dalton or 91 gigaelectron volt, and a very short lifetime. And the force works on very short range. This is a simplified summary scheme of the parity violating potential that you can calculate. It is basically, this is a simple expression that is didactic, not the way we do the calculations nowadays. You have a ground singlet, a parity violating Hamiltonian, and excited triplets. And you make a sum over states expression, and you have the usual spin orbit Hamiltonian. And the parity violating Hamiltonian has the Fermi constant here, which makes everything very small. You have a double sum over electrons and nuclei. Each nucleus, in addition to the electric charge, has this electroweak charge, and there you have the parity violating part of the Hamiltonian. And the electroweak charge is basically minus the neutron number and a small correction dependent on the proton number with the Weinberg angle. If you do that calculations for molecules, it turns out this is a multidimensional potential hypersurface, like the Born-Oppenheimer surface, depending on 3n-6 coordinates if n is the number of atoms. But of course, it's not like a Born-Oppenheimer, it's extremely small. And how it's 16 orders of magnitude smaller than the Born-Oppenheimer energies. How can we nevertheless do that accurately? Well, it has a different symmetry. This is antisymmetric with respect to space inversion, whereas the Born-Oppenheimer potential and all electromagnetic quantum chemistry, as I would call it, is including quantum electrodynamics, is parity conserving. So by the parity violation, you can get this thing separately. And the main idea now is, of course, to look at the slow evolution of parity, either with theory or with experiments. And this allows you to do fundamental physics, symmetries, and the structure and dynamics of chiral molecules. Chiral molecules is really something people at CERN at the time didn't think of. But in the meantime, actually, I had given twice lectures, both at Fermilab at CERN, where they were interested in these efforts. This is now the modern picture of chiral molecule potentials, simplified again, of course. you have two enantiomers, left and right, and a tunneling process connecting the two. And you have, with parity violation, asymmetry, which introduces, do you see me? Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, but we don't see the screen.
Yeah, something happened. Let me try again. Do you see it again?
Yes,
Yeah,
we do.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. With parity violation, you have a very small asymmetry in the effective potential, and that energy difference is 100 atto-electron volt to a femto-electron volt, perhaps. This completely suppresses tunneling between the two wells, and the states are not anymore parity symmetric. The Hund states, that I would call them, have positive and negative parity. These states are eigenstates that are localized. Now, if you superpose those eigenstates, you can actually measure then parity violation in chiral molecules by looking at the time evolution of the superposition. Oh. Well, I will skip that part of the lecture completely and look at the parity violation only. So now we are back to this process. That's the current frontier. We try to do an experiment on the prediction that happens on milliseconds to kiloseconds for this process. This process, I should mention, also is closely related to the question that is long-standing, the biomolecular homochirality. And since that was mentioned today, the correction of a Nobel Prize winner, this is from the Nobel lecture of Vladimir Brelok. He got for stereochemistry the Nobel Prize, a colleague from Zurich, a wonderful person, now deceased, unfortunately. And in his Nobel lecture, in the conclusion, he says, although the energy of both enantiomers and the probability of their formation in achiral environment are equal, only one enantiomer occurs on nature. And of course, we know we are all made of L amino acids in the proteins and D sugars in the DNA only. And so that's a big open question. And the point is, of course, here in this statement that it's incorrect. And so I discussed this quite a few times with Brelok, and to his 80th birthday, I dedicated this paper, which is called On the Measurement of the Parity Violating Energy Difference Between Enantiomers. If you think about it, it's on the order of atto-electron volt. It seems impossible. At that time, it seemed impossible. That is a picture from the symposium. You have Brelok in the middle here. If you see the arrow, here is Brelok sitting on his 80th birthday. Perhaps I just summarize the long journey and then tell you where we are with the experiment. You have first to develop a quantitative theory. This was sort of successful in the 90s. Then you need spectroscopic methods. For row vibrational line analysis, I stressed this importance of analysis where you can assign parity states. Nothing of that existed in the 80s until the 80s. It was successful in Zurich group for the first time in the 90s. Then you need to set up an experiment for parity selection and population transfer. This was successful in the last decade. And now we need to do that experiment on suitable molecules. So you should come back from this, that the current picture of chiral molecules, this is CH, FClBr, is that you have a slight ground state energy difference between the S and R enantiomer, which is on the order of 10 to the minus 11 joule per mole. Now, how do we measure this? The scheme is as follows. You start from a ground state of a chiral molecule with a very high barrier where tunneling is completely suppressed and the ground states have slightly different energy. So L and R are not the same. You excite to an excited state that is achiral. And this can have states of well-defined parity. With the second transition, you go to the ground state, and by selection rule, you generate a state of positive parity that can evolve in time, and then you can probe this evolution with sensitive laser technology. So this is a summary in scheme. You start from a localized eigenstate, that is chiral. You go to an excited state with well-defined parity, negative parity in this case. You go to the ground state, and then you generate a state of well-defined positive parity in this example. So it's a state that is both left and right. It's like a Schrödinger cat. I preferred the name quantum chameleon for this, and it has well-defined parity. And now this parity changes in time on the second time scale or millisecond time scale, and that change can be probed with laser spectroscopy because of the selection rules to the excited state. And by doing this, you get the time evolution and you get the energy difference because the half period is related to the parity-dividing energy difference by this simple equation. To give that picture of the quantum chameleon, I show you the spectrum of a typical chiral molecule. The R and S enantiomers have the same spectrum if you don't look for circular polarization, and they show lines that are positive and negative parity lines, if you are able to analyze the spectrum at this level. Now, if you generate a positive parity isomer, the negative parity lines disappear. Now, these energy differences, frequency difference, are on the order of megahertz. So that is not so difficult to measure. Now, if you measure as a function of time the appearance now of the spectrum of the negative parity isomer here at this point or at this point, then this change in time allows you to determine the energy differences of 100 electron volts. So just a brief summary again. You go from S to an excited state that is well-defined parity. You go to a ground state that is well-defined parity. You evolve in time and you probe. And you follow this, and this is the equation for the time evolution of parity. And we can do this now and simulate the experiment. We did the simulation of the experiment for this molecule. I will skip the details of that simulation. It's a chiral molecule. You see the parity dividing and the normal potential, and you see the free evolution of the wave packet of well-defined parity. This goes back and forth from left to right, and you see a scheme where you measure parity. That is the scheme that I showed you, and that is the evolution of parity on the time scale of milliseconds. You get signals on the order of 10 to the minus 6, which is about sensitivity in our experiments. Now, we can't do this on this molecule for reasons of technology. There is no laser in this frequency range. We tested that on ammonia, which is achiral, but where everything is known to do the experiment. And this shows you the experimental apparatus, how it works in the molecular beam. You have a beam, you have propagate this beam in this direction. You have a first laser that does the selection, the second laser that does the preparation. Then you have a free flight that takes a few milliseconds. And in that millisecond time, you have a change of parity, a small change, and that you have sensitive detection. And with this, you obtain the result. I will just summarize where we are with this experiment. By testing the sensitivity of this experiment, we have seen and demonstrated, of course, in ammonia, we see only parity conservation at this level. We see that we would be able to see about 100 electron volt energy difference between enantiomers. Next step would be to get the analysis done for a good, simple chiral molecule. This is highly non-trivial. One such molecule that we investigated, lutein, yes?
We're starting to run out of time now.
Yes, I go to the end. I just show you this molecule. This is one we work hard on. We have initial analysis available. Lutein, it looks strange to you. It's a benzene with 2 sulfurs, and the ring gets puckered, and then it makes it C2 symmetric and chiral. And it has actually relatively favorable parity-dividing energy difference on the order of about 1 femto electron volt, even though it is a factor of 10 larger than our sensitivity. And we hope that within a very short time, we will be able to analyze the spectrum in such a way that we can make the selection and preparation step. And with this, I go perhaps to the final slide. At this point, you can ask the question, will this experiment succeed? Well, it's actually borrowed from my colleague Zickernagel in Zurich. He is an experimentalist in medicine. And he says, if you have a real new experiment and the idea is bad and the experiment is bad, the result has a chance of being successful 10 to the minus 13. If the idea is good and the experiment is bad, you see an experiment will increase by a factor of 10. If the idea is bad, but the experiment is good, it's 10 to the minus 10. But even if the idea is good and the experiment is good, the chances only is 1 in 1,000. Actually, I think the experiment will succeed with 95% confidences where we are now as we continue to get funding and support for our group. Thank you also for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin. Very impressive. I don't find any questions in the Q&A, so those in the audience, maybe during the break you will come up with a question, then you can post it in the Q&A and Martin will have an opportunity to write a written answer. So Martin, I have a question to you. I've known and seen you for a long time, and I still have a problem to sort of figure out what you are. So could you tell me, are you a spectroscopist, a chemist, or a physicist, or what do you consider yourself?
Well, this was an interesting question when I was hunting for my first positions as a very young man. I often was asked the question, after all, what are you? Are you an experimentalist or a theoretician? Because they were either looking for an experimentalist or a theoretician. My answer to this was, well, I'm a scientist. I'm interested in everything in science, in experiment and theory. And I would consider myself to be basically an experimentalist with strong theoretical interests.
Thank you very much for a very good answer. So keep an eye on the Q&A. There might show up a question to you during the break.
Yes.
So we're going to have a break now for 1 hour. And we're going to gather here again at 6 o'clock p.m. Central European Time for the last session, where we're going to have 2 presentations. One by Anna Krylov from UCS in Los Angeles, and by coincidence, the next presentation by Tom Miller from Caltech. That's Los Angeles too. So let's give those 2 guys an hour to get their breakfast down and get dressed up for their presentations. See you here again at 6 o'clock.
See you.